It's also important as we get started discussing security that we understand some of the basic fundamentals of information security design. Some of these fundamentals are well-known design principles that will have application in almost every organization, no matter what you're designing security for. Some of these practices or some of these principles will help guide you along your way. And so we just identified them here, and I'll try to give you a couple of examples of each. First of all, the principle of separation of duties. This is where you separate the functions of the critical organizations or departments in your network and assign different parts of the operation to different people or personnel. An example of this is maybe a database administrator, for example, would not have administrative privileges throughout the entire organization. They'd only have administrative privileges on the database that they were responsible over. That is closely related to something called principle of least privileges, and this is something that is discussed in previous tutorials in a little bit of detail. But this is the principle that you only give the permissions or privileges to users in your network that they need to get their work done, and no more. And a common example of this is that you don't make an end user an administrator. You just make them part of a users group or just the groups that they need in order to have the access to the data that they need to get their work done. Also, another principle is to reduce the attack surface. The attack surface refers to the ports of entry into the data or into the machines in your network. And an example here is that if you don't need file sharing on a computer, then you disable the file sharing service on a particular machine. So you just disable unneeded services, disable unneeded protocols. All of these represent points of entry or points of access to the data on a specific server or a network. Defense in depth principle is a principle that dictates that you don't rely on just one defense mechanism. For example, you might want to require authentication, you might want to use permissions, you might want to use firewalls and gateways for emails. So you use a lot of different mechanisms to provide defense in depth. Diversity of mechanism, if you implement security in the same way on all of the systems in your network, then you're also providing the same means of compromise for that security system throughout your entire network. So in other words, if they're protected in the same way, then they all fail in the same way. Other types of principles that you need to keep in your mind as guiding lights that will help you design your security for your infrastructure. Use fail-safe defaults. A fail-safe default refers to a system that is configured for the most secure default action. In other words, that permissions are turned off. You turn on permissions as they are needed. You open ports on firewalls as they are needed to permit certain types of traffic. Otherwise, the fail-safe default is that all ports on a firewall are off. Another principle, economy of mechanism. This sounds like something that at first glance might be something that is counterintuitive to defensive depth or diversity of mechanism, but really what you have here is a principle that guides you that you use the most simple implementations to implement the security that you need. For example, if you don't need complex passwords, if your environment doesn't really require that, then don't make that a part of your security mechanism if you're not too worried about that complexity of passwords. And what that means is that if you have a password policy that dictates that you have a very complex password, then you may end up with users who stick their passwords on their monitor. And of course, that defeats the purpose, or that defeats defense in depth. It defeats diversity of mechanism as well. So economy and mechanism is that you implement the most straightforward and simple security mechanisms to achieve your objectives. Open designs uses designs and technologies that are open standards based. Standards like IP security that are reviewed by the open community so that flaws in the mechanism can be detected and corrected. So not only would this include IPsec for securing internet traffic or IP-based traffic, but also Kerberos authentication as well, also an open standards-based design security implementation. And then one final one I want to touch on here is trust but audit. Trust means that you give the users in your network the privileges that they need to do their job, but no one in the organization is beyond suspicion. So even your administrators, you want to audit For example, use of their administrative privileges. That can be something that is a good idea to audit. Also, another event that you want to typically audit is the rebooting of a computer. Especially on a server machine, a reboot indicates usually a change in some kind of way to the environment, and you want to link a reboot to a person or a user who caused the reboot so you can track down why that machine was rebooted. And then, of course, another reason why trust but audit is a good idea is just simple human nature. People get dissatisfied with either their boss or their job, and they can do malicious things to the system. So even though that you give someone wide-ranging rights throughout your network, you want to audit behaviors, especially behaviors that impact the data on your network.